the introduction to Aaron Hirsh. He's the chair of the Vermilion Sea Institute, a researcher in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And his essays have appeared in literary journals, the New York Times, Best American Science Writing. He's concerned with 3 areas in his research: molecular population genetics, epidemiology, and theoretical ecology. And he co-founded the biotech company Intercell. His book, which we're talking about today, was published last month by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and it's called Telling Our Way to the Sea. And you've heard about the coverage. So I'm going to introduce Aaron. Let me just give you a little bit of a blurb about Luba Orszewski from Nautilus magazine. We'll be interviewing him right after he gives his talk. She's the deputy editor of Nautilus, which is a new online and print magazine of science and culture, and she was previously a senior editor in trade books at Calgary and Macmillan. Nautilus magazine picks a new theme each month and explores it through newsworthy science stories, and our website is nautilus.us. And now, turn it over to Aaron.
Thanks. This is different from the other bookstore events I've had. Holding the mic like this, I feel like Geraldo Rivera. So I would like to start by telling a tale of 2 possible futures for the ocean. And they're stories drawn from 2 different parts of the world in 2 different times. One is from the present, one in a way is from the very deep past. There's a little bit of basic science you need to understand to kind of make sense of these stories. The life in the ocean is faced with a ubiquitous catch-22. It's stuck between 2 needs. The light that it requires for photosynthesis, that phytoplankton need for photosynthesis, comes from above, and it only goes about 100 feet down. It's in the photic layer at the very top of the ocean. All the nutrients tend to sink. The sulfur, phosphorus, everything that those same phytoplankton need to incorporate into biological molecules, that's far away in the dark. There are a few places around the globe where the process of upwelling brings water up to the surface of the ocean, and that phytoplankton can produce the sugars that drive the ecosystem from below. Each of these places that I'm going to talk about is one of very few special locations where that happens very powerfully. So the first is the Benguela current system off the west coast of Namibia. And it's the most productive water on Earth. In fact, it's the rate at which phytoplankton is synthesizing new sugar in that ecosystem is about 10 times the rate at which it's happening in our California current system, which is an important fishery. That Benguela fishery used to be spectacularly rich. In fact, it yielded about 1/10 of the world's total seafood every year. Then in the 80s, it was fished extremely hard by Soviet industrial fishing boats and Scandinavian ships, not Namibian vessels. And they drove that local abundant sardine population to such collapsed levels that a very different population moved in, an anchovy population. And then in an effort to bring back the sardines, the managers pointed all the vessels to the anchovy population, thinking that, okay, we'll knock down the competitor and the sardines will come back. But it didn't happen as they predicted. Instead, they knocked down the anchovy, and what happened was essentially that the water became so filled with biological muck, phytoplankton, zooplankton, that there was no oxygen left in the water. Bacteria started to metabolize these phytoplankton and zooplankton and release hydrogen sulfide gas as the product of their metabolism. And the water would visibly fizz. The ocean began to fizz with hydrogen sulfide gas, and the coastline began to stink. That process killed the remaining fish populations, or almost all of them. And what moved in were hydrogen sulfide tolerant jellyfish. And what moved in after the jellyfish were a very weird species called bearded goby, which eat jellyfish as well as sulfitic mud from the bottom of the ocean. But nobody's figured out how to eat a bearded goby yet. So this is one possible vision for the future of the oceans. And I mentioned the Benguela. I start with the Benguela because if our fishing capacity is such that it can drive down the Benguela current system, we can do it anywhere, right? We can transform any ecosystem at all to a sludge of jellyfish and phytoplankton. One ecologist called it the slippery slope to slime that we're on right now. We fish our way down the marine food web, starting from the top and ending up all the way down at the plankton. There's some discussion about whether the Benguela current ecosystem has found a new stable state. It's possible that those jellyfish consume enough of the eggs and larvae of the remnant populations of sardine and anchovy that they are securing their own stable state in the ecosystem. That is, they keep the fish populations from coming back and keep the ecosystem from returning to its former state. It's possible that we've gone from one stable equilibrium to another, but nobody really knows. And the reason nobody really knows is that we've continued to fish for the residuum of sardines and anchovies, which is now less than 1% of the former yield of the ecosystem. So why have we continued to fish? Or why have Scandinavian and Russian and other trawlers continued to fish for these fish in that ecosystem? Well, because there are industries in Namibia, canning industries, that require some input. They are livelihoods, and people can't do anything else. Namibian fishing boats too now depend on it. So a transition is very hard. You have canneries on the coast, you have fishermen who don't have other professions. It's hard to make that transition to doing something else. Even hard to lay off for 2 years and see what happens to the ecosystem, see if it begins to come back. The other place I want to talk about, the Sea of Cortez, which is the place that the book is about, has also been transformed dramatically and possibly permanently, but again, no one knows. What's happened there is that the large predatory fish, yellowtail, which you know as hamachi, or yellowfin tuna, mackerel, all the big fish that bring in high prices and go to sushi restaurants. They were fished out sometime in the 70s and 80s, and what replaced them then were jumbo squid. They're about 4 feet long, and they do provide a very productive fishery. They're the largest fishery in the Gulf of California, which is astonishing when you consider that they weren't even there until 1975, when the ecosystem was opened up for them by fishing for these more valuable things. So there too, there's some question about whether the ecosystem is stuck. Humboldt squid prey upon the young of all of those predatory fish. And so Humboldt squid may be the dominant predator that's here to stay. Again, nobody knows because we can't stop fishing. Fishing for all of those valuable species continues, and for some of the same reasons. The local fishermen rely on that catch for sustenance. They're stuck. They can't leave it alone for several years to see what happens, to see if it'll come back. There's another sort of deeper reason I think that it's been hard to stop fishing in the Sea of Cortez, and that's that the ecosystem has been so transformed for so long that a memory of the place has been lost. There's been a kind of shift in the idea of the sea by generational degrees. Fisheries managers refer to the shifting baseline. The idea is that each generation takes as its idea of the most abundant possible sea, the most abundant sea it has ever experienced. And for most fishery managers or fishermen, that was the sea they knew as in their childhood. That's what they think of as the abundant sea. But of course, generations back, the sea was far beyond their memory. And yet, when the next generation comes, the expectations of the ocean take another step down. I'll give you a couple examples. In the Sea of Cortez, there's, around the coast, there's a correlation among fishermen. There's an interesting sociological study showing a correlation between the age of a fisherman and his estimate of the maximum size of a fish. So if you ask a fisherman, how large does a yellowtail get? If the fisherman is over 70, he'll say 5 feet. If the fisherman is 30, he'll say 3.5 feet. The expectation of the sea has changed, and understandably, the fisherman who's 30 has never seen a 5-foot yellowtail because they're not left in the ocean. Even the language reflects this. The word mantarraya, manta ray, older fishermen use to refer to Manta birostris, which is a species that in adulthood is about 25 feet across. And they use a different word, cubana, for the species that are about 4 or 5 feet across, the members of the genus Mobula. The younger generation doesn't use the word cubana. They only have the word mantarraya. And for them, a mantarraya is a member of this genus Mobula, one of the 4 or 5 foot species. So the word has been transferred between generations from a species that was 25 feet across and is now gone to a species that's 5 feet across. Even the meaning of the words have changed in a way that reflects this degradation of our ideas of the ocean. So, a question is, how do we choose the Sea of Cortez as our future, the Sea of Cortez of the past, the deep past, as our future, and not the Benguela current ecosystem, or even the Sea of Cortez of the present? What do we need to do to make that choice? I think the basic point here is that we need to think one level deeper than policy. So policy, these are rules like how many tuna can we catch, how many Humboldt squid can we catch each season. We're pretty good as managers, as ecologists, at determining an amount of the population that we can safely catch and still preserve the sustainable fish population. It's not a hard question, actually. The harder question is, what institutions will pass those laws? What institutions will impose those policies and enforce them successfully? The analogy would be to the difference between like statutes and the Constitution, since we're in a law school. The statutes, we know what make the good laws. What we don't know is how to set up a government that's going to pass the good laws and enforce them. So I'll try to be more concrete. Around the world right now, the most common method for managing ocean fisheries is this. A manager decides how much fish can be caught in a sustainable fashion. That's the question that I said actually isn't so hard technically to answer. He then declares open season for anyone holding a license, and when his predefined amount of fish has come to the dock, he closes the fishery. He says, season over. So what this institution does is it sets up a race to fish. Fishermen are competing with each other to catch as much fish as they can in as short a time as possible. As a result, they supersize their gear. They invest as much as they can afford to invest in catching fish faster. This makes the fishermen poor because they are essentially spending all their money on larger gear to compete with each other to catch a finite amount of fish. It also has a terribly perverse effect on the manager. So the manager defines the catch for this season. Next season, he might need to rein in the catch a little bit, right? Maybe it's not a great year for sardines. He might need to back off his former estimate of the sustainable catch. But all of these fishermen have invested as much money as they can in fishing boats to catch sardines as fast as possible, and they have mortgages to pay on it. So he's under huge pressure from the fishing community not to reduce the amount of fish that can be caught. They made a rational decision about how big they could make their gear based on their expectation from last year. If he tries to rein it in, they're going to not make their mortgage payments this year on their boats. So there's a kind of ratchet effect. He's not able to back off. He's only able to increase the catch. This is what happened in the Pacific Northeast, the Northeast here, to all the fisheries. There was this ratchet effect where managers kept increasing because they were under great political pressure from fishermen who had overcapitalized their boats. So how did this happen differently? Well, one thing you can do is you can actually grant ownership to the fish population to fishermen in a perpetual way. So Juan, the fisherman for halibut in the Sea of Cortez, will own from now on 5% of the allowed catch. He essentially owns 5% of that population, and it's a property just like any other property. He can take a loan against it, he can rent it, he can sell it. But this changes things a lot. The manager still has to decide how much he wants to allow fishermen to catch, right? But now, Juan can go out and catch this 5% of the fish population whenever he wants. That means he doesn't have to invest hugely in larger and larger gear. It means he can go out when the fish price is high and not in this narrow season when all the fish is coming to market at the same time. More importantly, it means that he now is an owner of this population in perpetuity. So his incentive is now to make sure that the manager does a really good job of protecting his asset. He becomes a patrolman, essentially, on the ocean, preventing others from fishing who are not owners. And he becomes an advocate for the manager making sustainable decisions about how much can be caught. This system is called catch shares, or catch shares is a simple term, and it actually has worked in a number of places. It's worked in New Zealand and Iceland to turn around their fisheries. In a way, though, they don't go far enough, because the guy who owns 5% of the halibut population, he's thinking only about the halibut population. But what about all those other resources that used to be there in the Sea of Cortez? What about the yellowtail? What about the manta ray? What about the oysters, which were present in magnificent abundance in the Sea of Cortez and are now gone? Or the sardines that were large fisheries in the Sea of Cortez. He doesn't think about those. He doesn't worry about those. So if his practice adversely affects the sardine population, he doesn't care as long as his halibut is protected. The solution to this is to grant property rights to the entire ecosystem. That is, one gets not just 5% of the halibut population, but 5% of everything. He then gets to make a decision about what he wants to fish, and he has the long-term sustainable view of the ecosystem that's broad enough to to allow him to think, okay, I'm going to fish for my halibut in a way that's not going to hurt my own ownership of yellowtail, that sort of thing. So essentially, I guess the conclusion for the futurists is that, one more thing. This also gives him fishing communities, a way to deal with that big challenge I mentioned of leaving the fish population alone for a few years. Because if he owns something as a right, as a property, he can sell futures in it. This is what farmers do all the time, right? They sell futures of their corn, so that you can buy an interest in next season's corn. He can sell an interest in the halibut catch 2 years from now, when the catch share system is imposed, that gives him the cash he needs to wait for 2 years and leave it all alone. It's essentially a cash advance from investors that's against future returns of this ecosystem. It's a strange idea, and it's, we can talk more about it, but the idea is essentially that the most promising future for the ocean might be in selling ocean futures. That's the sort of strange idea I want to leave you with, and we can start to talk about it if there's more interest in that. Great, thanks.
That was a really interesting and completely counterintuitive idea of the future of the oceans. Not anything that I thought of. And can you tell us a little bit? I mean, I was really struck also. Your Scientific American article was really about how hard it was to intervene, to do any kind of planning about how precarious it is, as you were saying. You think that in order to balance out the sardine population, you're gonna eliminate the anchovies, their competition, but in fact you get the completely opposite results. So it's always this risk of unintended consequences. So can you tell us a little bit, if this privatization is implemented, and you have, let's say Juan owns 5%, and everyone else also owns 5%. How do you keep those people from essentially competing against each other?
The way the system is set up, they actually, they're not, is this on? Yeah? Yeah, there it is. They're actually not competing against each other, because, when these systems have been implemented successfully, they've been in, essentially, catch shares, ownership of the population has been given to a local community, a group of people who are already fishing. There's a defined, let's say there are 100 people who are fishing. Mm-hmm. And they're usually allocated kind of evenly across the community, so each fisherman gets 1% or something of the fish population. The reason they're not competing with each other is that each fisherman knows each season what his 1% represents in terms of kilograms of fish. So the manager sets a limit for a season, and then each fisherman gets 1% of that. They're competing with each other in a sense that it might take them longer because the others are fishing, but they have a whole year to catch their quota of 1%. By contrast, in a typical derby fishery, the way they're mostly managed in the world right now, an open season will be 3 weeks or 5 weeks, something like that. So there's intense competition among fishermen, and there's no cap on what they can bring in. In a catch share system, there's a cap on what each fisherman can bring in. He owns that 1% yield from that 1% of the yield from the population that year, and that's as much as he can bring in. And he's not going to bring in less because he's going to have plenty of time to fish for it. So there's really no competition between fishermen, and in fact, all of the fishermen are thinking not just about how much they're going to catch this year. They're thinking, of course, about how much they're going to catch decades from now. And so they also have an interest in getting together and changing the way they fish if they have a sense that doing that might result in increases in the fish population in the future. So, for example, lobster fishermen in New Zealand completely invented new ways of trapping lobster because they had the intuition that their traps were taking out young lobsters more than they wanted. And so the fishermen drove the change in practice with a view to bringing the population back. And they were rewarded with something like a 60% increase in the population size.
Yeah, you would think that it's the fishermen who know the populations best.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
their patterns.
Yeah, I think that's true, although because of this shift in ideas of the sea over generations, fishermen have a sense of how their practice impacts the population, but they probably don't have a sense of the population's maximum size. And to discover that, the only thing that they can do really is lay off for a few years and watch what happens to the population size. And this is where fisheries managers talking with fishermen come in. They can say, you know, if you lay off this population for a season, we can see if this population might actually have twice the sustainable size that you think it does. Something like that.
And mostly we've just been talking about overfishing. Can we talk a little bit about other damage that's done to seas, you know, either development or something like an oil spill?
Mm-hmm.
And what's been your experience with that?
I think there's one overwhelming force, I think, and that's trawling. Trawling the bottom of the continental shelf for seafood. It's probably far and away the biggest impact on ocean ecosystems.
Not really, even worse than an oil spill?
Well, oil spills are relatively local.
Mm-hmm.
Trawling is across the continental shelves of the world, and in that area, each region is scraped. The bottom of the sea is scraped on average between once a year and once every 2 years. So imagine what it would be like if you took, you know, like a chain between bulldozers on the land and drove across the landscape once a year or once every 2 years. The landscape would look very different. And in places in the North Sea, it's actually being hit several times per year on average. So there's not much time for benthic bottom-dwelling ocean ecosystems to recover between the moments at which they get trawled, which is essentially like a chain coming across the bottom. So that's a huge one. Of course, there's one big unanswered question, since we're thinking about the future, which is the impact of not just climate change, but atmosphere chemistry change. So climate change is affecting the oceans, but in a way, ocean-dwelling life is pretty well equipped to deal with climate change. They move north and south. I mean, north in the northern hemisphere and south in the southern hemisphere to find places where the water is the temperature that suits them. It's harder to do that if you're in Yellowstone Park and you need to move north or south. And they move at about the appropriate velocity to track the changing water temperatures in the ocean. So climate change probably isn't as big a deal as ocean acidification. Ocean acidification, I don't know if you guys know about this, but the increase in the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, we all think of it as changing climate, but that CO2 also dissolves into the ocean. That is a plus for mitigating climate change, but it's a big minus for changing ocean chemistry. It essentially acidifies the ocean. That carbon dioxide becomes carbonic acid when it dissolves into the ocean. And carbonic acid makes it very hard for all of those animals that depend on calcium carbonate, which are like clams and stuff. I mean, those are the ones we see, but the ones we don't see are teeny tiny. And there's evidence that they fail to form their skeletal material in water that is acidified. So either we're going to watch some really amazing Darwinian evolution over the next 10 years, or we're going to watch some ecological catastrophe in the oceans.
Wow.
Bummer, sorry.
So, yeah, there's no absolute sense of, this is the level of healthy sea life that we're all accustomed to. Because we said every generation establishes their own level.
Yeah.
So what is it like in studying an area, studying an ecosystem, where you don't have a sense of what your goal is?
One of the, talking about this stuff is depressing, but I didn't feel depressed about the book. And one reason was that the experience of writing the book was an experience of realizing how easily one recovers at least an idea, a memory of what the sea was like. It happens almost automatically as a result of just picking a creature and telling stories about it. The reason it happens automatically is that those stories are essentially they make connections between creatures. So I'll give you an example, the manta ray that I mentioned. The first place that I found mentions of manta rays in the Sea of Cortez was in the literature of the pearl industry. And the reason they mentioned manta rays is that they were convinced that manta rays were the gravest danger for pearl divers. They thought that manta rays would hover above the pearl divers, and when the divers came up, the manta rays would envelop them and devour them. And manta rays are filter feeders, they eat plankton. But reading that, you think, pearl industry. What pearl industry? There are no pearl oysters in the Sea of Cortez. The coasts are like these really nice beaches. But in the 17th century, those coasts weren't beaches. They were solid oyster beds. And between 1600 and 1800, all of those oysters were removed. Later, keep following the manta ray forward. The next place the manta ray got hit was by fishing boats that would take them as incidental catch. Fishermen would harpoon them and take home a 25-foot animal. Why not? Even though they weren't targeting the manta ray, it was an incidental catch. But a harpoon, what is a fishing boat doing with a harpoon? Today's fishing boats don't carry harpoons. The Pongas and the Sea of Cortez have fish traps and gill nets and that sort of thing. They have harpoons because they were looking for turtles. And there used to be 4 turtle species in the Sea of Cortez, which you never see anymore. They would also look for giant sea bass, which are now functionally extinct in the Sea of Cortez. So you see how you pick an animal and you start looking into just one creature's history, and inevitably you run across the things that used to be there that are now missing. They're like the holes in the fabric. You follow a thread and you run into a hole in the fabric of the ecosystem. So it's funny to say this, but I found that kind of hopeful, because at least it means that we can recover a sense of what the ecosystem potentially can be. And when presented with an idea of what the ecosystem potentially can look like, that it could have pearl oysters, that it could have 4 species of turtle, I think it becomes politically easier to try to manage for that as a target, to sell that as a vision. So you start thinking that is the ocean of the future.
The past.
The deep past is the ocean of the future. Is it feasible to get there? I think it depends a lot on these institutional structures and how they manage the ocean.
As a biologist, kind of on a biological level, are there still enough is there like a critical mass of pearls that, given the right conditions,
Yeah.
they would be able to
Pearl oysters would be the easiest thing to bring back. It would take an aquaculture company that's interested in investing in the future and knows about what used to be there. And these exotic pearl oysters, we still find them, actually. When we're diving in the Sea of Cortez, we still find Pintada mazapanica, which is the rainbow pearl oyster, which Hernán Cortez went just completely crazy for, because it's very different from other pearls in the world. So they're there. They're just very rare. Can we make our way back to a system that's dominated by yellowtail and and yellowfin tuna and not Humboldt squid, there nobody knows, but nobody has tried yet because there hasn't been an ability to lay off fishing for the more precious species.
Right, so the potential is there.
Yeah.
I wondered if we could talk a little about the process of writing the book. How did you decide that you were going to write a book about the state of Cortez, and did you have specific goals that you wanted to reach?
That's funny. This is the first time the process question has come up, and I've been afraid of the process question because the process is super boring. I mean, the process is. I can talk about where the idea of the book came from. That's not boring. The process is as boring as 5 hours a day sitting at your computer. It's not fun.
Well, maybe more about storytelling. I feel like you're such a great storyteller. I mean, think of the chapter on the manta ray. It's kind of a suspense story. You're reading it, you want to know, is Pablo going to remember there are the 4 species there originally?
Right.
And you really kind of take the reader on the journey to find this out. So more, I wonder if you could talk about, how you decided on these episodes. Whether the vignettes were sort of composites of other stories that you might have wanted to tell. Because there's probably a point where sort of the science ends and the art begins, and you have to make some really hard choices.
It is, in fact, it's nonfiction that the whole story started with the sea cucumber. So that's like a refrain in the book, and it's the first chapter of the book is a sea cucumber coming up to the surface on my wife's hand, on Veronica's hand. And that actually was the sort of origin point of the book. A sea cucumber is really ugly and it's not an appealing animal. And one day Veronica went down and took one off the bottom of the sea and brought it up for students to look at. And I won't tell the whole story, but
did you remember that it was different before 5 years ago? Or?
Well, so that was interesting. So when I saw the sea cucumber, I took it as evidence for. It was the first time I'd gone diving there, and I took it sort of intuitively as evidence of this place's pristine nature. That is, here was an animal that I'd been diving before in other places, but I hadn't ever seen one of these, a big sea cucumber. So I thought, oh gosh, this place is remote and exotic. Look at this animal we have. But I later learned, in fact, later that day learned from Veronica that 3 or 4 years earlier, she had sat on the terrace of the Vermilion Sea Field Station and watched boat after boat returning across the bay, heaped high with brown sea cucumbers. And before that season, there had been about 1 sea cucumber every square meter in the Bay of LA where we were. And after that season, they were reduced to such scarcity that finding one was a special occasion. So that was a starting point for me for the idea that we take as our idea of wilderness the most exotic wild place we've ever seen, or the most exotic wild place we remember, maybe from our childhood or from a special trip or something. But we're wrong about that, right? We're wrong just the way I was wrong when I just looked at the sea cucumber and thought, oh, this place must be really, really remote and pristine. In fact, I could have taken that cucumber as testament to how thoroughly exploited that bay was. But I didn't know it because I didn't have that deeper memory.
Right.
So it was the beginning of that idea of the sea cucumber. But then also later in the day, I sat on the terrace with some kids and we just started talking about this ugly little animal. And it became the starting point for a lot of different interesting conversations. Conversations that led to other parts of the ecosystem. And that's when I thought, oh, if you just take a creature, even an ugly little thing like a sea cucumber, and start telling its stories, you're going to make your way out across the entire historical ecosystem very quickly, actually, because we had that experience of starting at this humble point and realizing just how rich the bay used to be. So yeah, that was the year that I thought, this could be a book.
Yeah, and the idea of wilderness also comes up in your essay for novelists about what wilderness students in the book, and
Yeah.
we discussed this with them, and
Yeah.
cleared it by them, and how they felt about it.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I didn't clear it with them. I changed all their names and even some defining characteristics. Though there are certain extraordinary students who you couldn't discuss. I mean, we had one student with us who was blind, and the student who went on the Baja trip, who was blind, was obviously going to recognize himself in the book. And I suppose the reason I felt comfortable doing that is that they were so, and they're such extraordinary people, and it was generally very easy to depict them in a positive light. I have since learned how dangerous it is to write about people, because a few of them have said, one of them who I think of as only a hero in the book, said to me, "Is it true that one side of my smile is higher than the other side?" I realized that this is a dangerous business, writing about people, so the next thing might be a novel. But I'd say that they were very special people, and they're obviously a big part of the book just because of who they are. But they're also part of an idea that's in the book, that we go to places like Bahia Los Angeles, not just to be in an exotic ecosystem, but to be with other people in a way that other settings might not allow. And that was an interesting realization for somebody who's basically interested in ecosystems and animals and plants. That one of the reasons I'm interested in ecosystems and animals and plants is actually that they are an occasion to meet other people in really substantive ways. I mean, the experiences that I had with those kids looking at a sea cucumber are only experiences that I could have had looking at a sea cucumber with them. And so in a way, the focus shifted in writing of the book from the sea cucumber to the kids looking at the sea cucumber. I became more of a humanist in the process of writing the book, because I started thinking about them and not just about the science of the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think what makes the book just have so many different dimensions and so many different levels. It's sort of like you don't just hug the microphone and tell the readers what you think about marine life. But you use this, you tell the story through the students and through their opinions. Actually, one of something that really caught my eye, and I thought that was almost kind of a metaphor for the rest of the book. At a certain point, you talk about a friend who's a philosopher who never doesn't listen to her at all. She's really sitting down. One of the reasons she really dislikes nature is because she goes in there and she's just overwhelmed by all the different elements, and they kind of overwhelm her to the point where she doesn't see anything. She's bored. And I thought that was such an amazing. It was almost kind of like a metaphor for the way you treat the question of the ocean. Is that on the one hand it is about the extinction of the yellowtail species, but at the same time you kind of work backwards and you unravel this whole puzzle of the economic investment and the fishing grounds, the fishing whose livelihood this depends on, and so it becomes not just kind of a story of the sea, it becomes a story of the community. But I wondered if we could also just switch gears and talk about, we've just been talking about the oceans, as something that's full of marine life, but I wonder if we could talk a little bit about extreme weather, about, how oceans impact us, not just what's going on inside of them.
Right. This is sort of topical.
Yes, this is topical. Aaron just escaped from Boulder, Colorado, where flash floods.
So in the book, I talk about this hurricane, and it's funny. What I just said about sea cucumbers, you could also say about hurricanes. That is, there are occasions to be with people in ways that you otherwise couldn't. There are occasions to get to know people in ways that you otherwise couldn't. That storm, which ended up not hurting anyone happily, and in a way dissipated book was about that. It also provided me as an author with an arc, right? Because the storm is perfect for plot. The storm is on the way for a long time, and then it hits, and then it leaves,
Yeah.
and then the book ends.
And a lot happens during the storm too.
Yeah. In terms of extreme weather as it relates to environmental science,
Yeah, does it?
does it? I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's clear. I'm not a climate
So I
scientist.
guess you were talking about the fact that, marine life is so well adapted that, they're not that affected by climate change. But,
Are they affected by extreme events?
yeah, are they affected by
I don't.
extreme
That's an
events?
interesting question. I don't know how the increase in intensity of storms. There are ways in which the ocean could be dramatically affected by climate change that wouldn't be so simple for marine life to adjust to. So I'm sort of backing up on that. They're not big hurricanes. I don't know what the increase in intensity of storms is, but there are potential changes in current direction and intensity that could change the ocean a lot. And I'm not the person to talk about that, but it is a possibility that changes in ocean current result in big regional shifts in basins of the ecosystem. And it has already happened. The North Sea now has a different ecosystem than it did 10 years ago because of because of a shift in the climate system. Different dominant species. It's incredible. You look at pictures of what fishing boats bring in 1975, and it's a net full of big silver fish. And you look at the net in 1999, after a big climate shift happened in 98, and it has changed completely to large red crabs. So it's a completely different ecosystem. But that's really the trend of climate scientists and oceanographers.
Are there projections into the future about, I guess since we've been talking so negatively about a slippery slope towards slime, are there projections about, is it possible that we're just going to overfish and fall to the point?
Well, the Big Web shows that it is possible. Yeah, it's possible that we could do that in every. We won't necessarily get bubbling hydrogen sulfide in every single ecosystem.
Yeah.
But it's certainly possible that we will get a proliferation of jellyfish in many different ecosystems that will fish our way down the food chain to a point at which many important ecosystems are dominated by jellyfish. Entirely possible.
What do you think about farmed fish?
Really interesting area. The limitation on aquaculture as it's done now is the supply of fresh water. Aquaculture right now, the total supply from marine fisheries is about 90 million metric tons per year. Aquaculture is pretty big. It's about 30 million metric tons per year. But you can't grow freshwater aquaculture much more because of the limitation, the scarcity of fresh water. You can potentially grow marine aquaculture, but marine aquaculture, of course, has this problem that you need to fish to feed the fish. So when you buy salmon, for example, that nice Norwegian farm salmon, they have been fed with fish that are wild caught. So, and their conversion ratio is about 1 to 4. That is, it's pretty good, but still, you're catching about 4 times in weight little fish to feed to the big fish. There are potentially other things you could do to farm marine fish in an efficient way. You could come up with different agricultural products and things like oysters and mussels, like they're ecosystem plus. Yeah. So there are ways to do this that are successful. It is not necessarily scaling up what currently exists.
And do you see these, we're talking about the implementation of privatizing parts of the ecosystem that's been done in New Zealand and parts. Is it something you think happening in the US?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, the U.S. has begun to implement cat shares in many fisheries, the Alaska salmon fishery just shifted, and halibut fishery just shifted from kind of open season management to catch shares management. So that is being done. In a way, those coastal communities of the East Coast and the West Coast would be perfect places to implement ecosystem-based catch shares, because you have a really intelligent, sophisticated managerial community that can talk to fishermen about how best to maximize the long-term value of their property. That is, you should fish this many scallops, this many halibut, that they could get the advice they would need. It hasn't been done yet, but it might be a good idea.
And just to kind of close it up, what do you feel has been the most surprising thing for you writing the book?
Being in Geraldo Rivera's cabinet.
Yeah, that was a surprise.
Yeah, I knew it was Geraldo's. I didn't know it was Geraldo Rivera. The most surprising thing about writing the book? I guess hearing from people who are reading it, what their experience of reading it has been like, and feeling this amazing similarity between what they're describing as their experience of reading it and what I remember as my experience of writing it.
That's great. I mean, that makes you really get to
With certain people who, took the time to send me an email, there's this miraculous, to me, miraculous sense that, I put together this tall stack of pages and sent it out to the world, and my experience of this work was in so many ways replicated out there in the world. That has been, I'd say, the most surprising thing. Those occasional emails from readers who said, I was reading this chapter and this is what I thought. This is what I thought. Yeah, it was very good.
Yeah, well, what's next for you? So is there another book or are you hoping for another project?
Stay tuned, I'm not sure.
Okay, so I think this might be a good time to open it up to the floor.
Sure. Let me just get a microphone so we can.
Hi, I'm watching shows like Deadliest Catch when we first started, and seeing where the fishermen were years ago, and now you can see there's a change in what fish they can catch, and where they're finding them. 10 years ago, just were not available now. What I found appalling was the amount of fish they were catching in competition with each other, and wondering how much, are actually eaten. I mean, do we have stats on how many fish just go to waste, just in trash, whether they're being sold to Japan, whether they're sold in this country? Do we have any idea worldwide how much are lost after they're caught?
Yeah. So that estimate for, I think the best estimate for globally bycatch is about 30%. So that means they catch an extra 1/3, which actually wasn't as bad as I thought it was. In certain fisheries, it's much worse than that. So in shrimp, for example, the shrimp fishery catches about 1 pound of shrimp for 10 pounds of everything else. And everything else, it depends on the management system. Sometimes it goes into the fish meal that feeds those marine aquaculture fish. Sometimes, most often gets dumped overboard. So, to answer your question, the global bycatch is about 30%. So 30% sounds like one thing, but when you say 30 million metric tons of fish a year is dumped back into the sea, it's a big number.
It's a problem.
What happened with the main lobster? Because now lobsters are very common. And I wonder if there's any downside to that, lobsters. But then I think, well, we brought back from the extinction white-tailed deer and kangaroos.
Right. Yeah, this is an interesting story. And it has happened not just in Maine, but all the way up the coast good 200 years in that area, and it was fished into collapse. Cod eat little lobsters, and so do other large bottom-dwelling fish. They also eat little, what are those crabs called? I don't know what the super market name is for them, the long arms. The snow crab. They also eat snow crab and shrimp. And so when the cod finally collapsed off the east coast of Canada, once and for all, really, in the late 80s, the economies, whole towns were shuttered. And about 5 years later, those towns opened up again because of the surge in shrimp and crab populations. And the shrimp and crab fishery is now worth more than the cod fishery was even when the cod population was healthy. So we have a really interesting decision to make. And the same is true in Maine. It was cod first, and Maine went through a number of intermediate steps where there were other large fish that took over. But now we have an interesting decision to make. Do we manage for lobster and crab and shrimp and keep those fish populations low? Or do we manage for the fish that were there before? Because in fact, the market size for lobster, crab, and shrimp is bigger than it was for fish. The ecosystem, of course, was a large fish-dominated ecosystem. And this question is coming up in poignant form right now in Nova Scotia because the cod are starting to come back. And some people don't want the cod to come back because they're fishing crab and shrimp. Difficult political and social problem.
So to survive in the coming world, it's best to be a crustacean or
Right. The future right there. Was dominated by crustaceans and belly.
Just going to go from front to back.
So in the system you described where the rights to fish a particular area are allotted among the fishermen of that area, is there a way for new young fishermen to join that system, and what happens to the shares as those older fishermen retire?
The way they've been implemented so far, the shares can be sold or leased. And people talk about this as a challenge for catch shares. They're inequity in that the generation that happens to be there when the catch shares are implemented, they have catch shares given to them. The next generation has to buy the catch shares or inherit the catch shares, just like any other property. The biggest concern is that as those property rights get transferred, you end up with large corporate ownership of the oceans. Not a good thing. In practice, that has happened a little bit. There has been an increase in the average vessel size in New Zealand and Iceland associated with catch shares, meaning the fishery is more dominated by the richer fishermen and by fewer of them. But I think we do have ways of addressing problems like this. We're used to encumbered property encumbered by certain restrictions. And in these cases, including the New Zealand and Iceland fisheries, some of them, where this has worked, there are restrictions about who can actually own catch shares. You have to be a resident. So this is how, for example, if I had my way, this is what I would do in Bahia, Los Angeles. You would have to be a resident of Bahia, Los Angeles to own catch shares in that local fishery. After that first generation, the catch shares would be passed on to children, which is, by the way, how licenses are handled. I mean, you do have the same problem with existing fishery systems. The government gives out licenses, and when an old fisherman retires, the license needs to go to a new fisherman, and usually that some credit is given to the descendants of the fisherman who gave up his license. So you have to pay attention to where people live and who they're descended from in determining who's allowed to get catch shares.
He's
spoke about the acidification of the oceans. And this doesn't sound good for crustaceans, so what would you want to see happen with fossil fuels? What would you say to the politicians and to the voters? What would you like them to understand?
This is not my area of expertise, but I'll give you my best guess. Carbon tax. That's my best guess from what I've read. To reduce fossil fuel emissions. But it's not really my area. To go back to my area, it's not so much the crustaceans we're worried about. It's things that use calcium carbonate, which actually isn't crustaceans. They have a different stuff on their outside. So we're Connie sitting next to you is right. The crustaceans are going to be fine. We're more worried about the little zooplankton and stuff. Yeah.
Well, the Asians eat jellyfish, so
They do, and more of us are going to have to start. Although the Asians eat jellyfish, but not enough jellyfish. The Sea of Japan has had a serious problem with outbreaks of large jellyfish recently, and it's a problem because what the fishermen were fishing for has a much higher price per pound than jellyfish, even though jellyfish does go on the table.
How do you net jellyfish?
You don't. You mean intentionally or unintentionally? So what happens unintentionally? They're cohesive enough that they come up in a net, and this is the problem in the Sea of Japan. That fishing boats have been pulling up their nets, and the nets are so full of giant jellyfish that they can't hoist the net in. And there have been a couple cases of the trawlers pulling in their nets and tipping over into the sea because the net is so full of jellyfish, which I just think is the most fantastic little symbol of global fisheries and what's happening. Like our nets are filling up with jellyfish, and our fishermen are getting dumped into the sea in the process.
And then the fishermen get stung.
I'm not sure what happens to the fishermen.
So, when you're talking, say, overfishing and seemingly in isolation, but isn't the fact that we have 7 billion people on Earth a real factor? And how, if we're talking about overfishing now and the population increases, how can we really hope to feed more and more people?
So, 10 billion is a problem. 12 billion is a bigger problem. But a well-managed ocean, if you look at the fisheries as they're managed now, and the percentage of them that are collapsed and therefore yielding much lower than they potentially could, a very well-managed multi-species global fishery could yield nearly twice as much as the current global fisheries do in a sustainable way. So this doesn't solve the problem, but it does mean that oceans could continue to provide the amount of seafood per person that people eat now into the future, even as we go to 10 billion. But the average amount of seafood per person is pretty low right now, right? Because huge amounts of the world don't eat seafood. I would also say that managing fisheries well actually interacts with demographic processes in the way you would hope, because countries with well-managed fisheries become richer, communities with well-managed fisheries become richer, and when countries become richer, their birth rate goes down. It happens again and again. And when resource supplies and economic supplies become more secure, that is, the future is less uncertain, then birth rates go down. It's because people have kids to hedge against the future in a way. I mean, in countries where the future is most unpredictable, people are having most kids, and as those countries So in sum, yes, it's a problem. There are 7 billion, potentially 10 billion people. That said, managing the oceans improves the situation, not just by giving these people more to eat, but actually by reducing the birth rate, by making the countries richer.
So I have a question about, you've been talking about sort of if we stop fishing certain populations and sort of wait and see as ecosystems rebound. If we want to accelerate the process, or if we have an ecosystem where it's sort of collapsed, what we think is past the point of no return, is it responsible to try to take some kind of action to introduce populations, or are there things we can do, or do we have to just sit back and wait?
So it's a really interesting question. And this is what Luca was sort of alluding to. Ecologists call this possibility biomanipulation. That is, can we tinker with the ecosystem in a way that will shape it as we hope? Maybe. The Benguela current ecosystem is a bit of a warning in that people tried to do that and it didn't go well. On the other hand, a place like the Benguela is so screwed up now that you don't have much to lose. And you might actually try, for example, fishing intensely for things that have very little market value, hoping to make space for the things that are valuable. In the Sea of Cortez, the possibility would be to intentionally overfish Humboldt squid and hope to bring back yellowtail, yellowfin tuna, all of those really valuable fish. I think before you do that, you've got to at least give it 5 years and see what happens. In an ecosystem that you understand really well, like that one, it might be worth a try if it doesn't bounce back on its own.
How do they prevent those trawlers from foreign countries from coming in, interfering with the catch share?
From foreign countries?
But remember, we were thinking about Namibia.
Yeah.
It says this ships from Russia.
Yeah, they had licenses granted by the Namibian government.
So the catch share system would end
Well,
those licenses?
it would give fishermen strong incentive to try to politically protect their waters. So in well-managed areas, this is an important issue, I'm glad you brought it up. In well-managed areas, foreign vessels don't come in. They're not allowed to come in. For example, in the U.S. fisheries, there is virtually no fishing by foreign fleets. In Mexico, there's quite a lot. Partly that has to do with the capacity of the Mexican fleet relative to other countries. Partly it has to do with the Mexican government's willingness to sell licenses for a lot of money to foreign countries, foreign businesses. The important trend that really needs addressing here is the movement of vessels from the developed world to the developing world in response to responsible management in the developed world. So as Europe has managed more and more responsibly, it has succeeded in decreasing the intensity of fishing on European coasts, and European fisheries are doing a bit better. But all those vessels haven't disappeared. They're fishing on the coast of Africa now. And it's bad for Africa. It's bad for Africa in ways that are measurable. There's this amazing study showing that the amount of bushmeat in African markets is correlated with the number of European fishing vessels off of African coasts. And this is because when European fishing vessels are off the coast of Africa, the locals' supply of fish is decreased, and they turn for their source of protein to bushmeat, the species they can hunt. So it clearly impacts those communities, and it's really unconscionable, and it's an important international political problem to rein in.
The related question is, how do the catch shares honest? How can they measure what each fisherman's bringing in? They can't monitor each person.
You do monitor each person.
Wow.
So in New Zealand and Iceland, there's a monitor on every single fishing boat.
Some of those boats are small, isn't it?
No, in Mexico, they're small. And in places, in New Zealand and Iceland, they're pretty large fishing ships. In Mexico, the way you would have to do it is at port, the way fisheries are trapped now. It's whatever the fishermen offload. And the fishermen have to sell their fish when they get to port. So they can't, there's not much of a black market in halibut. Because you just can't, it has to go through a distribution system.
This will be end of the line. He said there's actually turned on fish, the illegal fish.
Right.
And in some places they are able to drive to the next time. That's somehow sell illegal. They'll actually, he describes a case where fishermen getting along for that, really large vessel. The guy says, "But look, your quotas are higher, you're catching the fish, and they are long." So the fisherman said, "We're going to get it, fishing catfish. We're going to get it illegal." They just came out and said that it's so common, it's so exciting. It's like a local business person saying, "Oh,
Yeah.
we do a cash business."
Yeah. I feel like should we take one more question and then close up? Sean?
Hi, I have a question about oysters. Actually, you mentioned the Sea of Cortez. And as you probably know, all around New York City, way back when, there was an immense amount of oyster beds. How long, to the best of your knowledge, could oysters be reintroduced to this area? And then what would be the acceleration rate that oysters would actually propel us into the biodiversity that we would want to see back in this area?
I don't know about this area,
Okay.
so I can't answer the question about New York. I know that in the San Diego area, they were able to start a very lucrative aquaculture facility. It took about 6 to 8 years to turn the corner to profitability on a multi-species aquaculture venture. But I don't know what these waters are like.
Okay.
It doesn't look good, but I'm not sure.
It's a little rough.
Thank you very much for coming out, and I will be at McNally Jackson on Thursday if you haven't had enough.
And Aaron's book is available?
Yeah, please.